If I asked whether your organization does periodic access reviews, you'd probably say yes. If I asked whether those reviews actually prevent people from keeping permissions they shouldn't have, you might give me a completely different answer. Most organizations can prove their access reviews happened. Very few can prove their access reviews worked. This isn't about organizations that skip access reviews or ignore compliance requirements. This is about something more troubling. Organizations that religiously complete access reviews on schedule, generate all the required documentation, and still have serious problems with excessive permissions and privilege creep. The process happens, the paperwork gets filled, the auditors are satisfied, and yet people continue to have access they shouldn't have. An access review process that produces completed paperwork is not the same thing as an access review that produces better access decisions. Most organizations have confused the completion of the process with the achievement of the security outcome. So let's talk about what an access review actually looks like from the reviewer's perspective, because understanding why reviews fail requires understanding what reviewers experience. So a business manager receives an email that it's time to review the access for the team. They click a link and see a list, sometimes dozens or hundreds of line items showing various permissions, group memberships, and even application roles assigned to each person who reports to them. The list contains entries like ones for a Salesforce power user or AD group finance reporting tier 2. Each person has 10 or 15 or even 20 of these entries. The manager needs to decide whether each permission is still appropriate. They have the regular job to do as well, right? This review appeared in their inbox alongside 50 other messages requiring attention. There's a deadline, usually 2 weeks, and reminder emails will escalate to the director if they don't complete it on time. For each line item, they click approve or revoke. There's a comments field. That's about it. Now here's the question. What does the manager actually know about whether those particular groups is still appropriate for Jennifer, who joined their team 9 months ago? They probably don't know what that group actually permits. They don't know when Jennifer received that access or why. They don't know if she ever used it. They don't really know if other people in similar roles have it or if Jennifer is an outlier. They don't know if removing it will break something Jennifer needs for her job. What they do know is that Jennifer has this access for at least the past 9 months, and nothing has exploded, right? They know that clicking approve for everything takes 5 minutes. They know that clicking revoke might generate a help desk ticket, an angry message from Jennifer or a productivity problem they'll be blamed for. So they approve everything. They complete the review by the deadline. The system records that access certification happened. Everyone moves on. So I've seen this play out when reviewing access certification programs for organizations. I remember one company that was really proud of their 98% completion rate for access reviews. When I started interviewing the managers who were actually doing these reviews, a very different picture emerged. One manager told me she received a spreadsheet with about 200 lines of permissions and group memberships for her team. She recognized maybe 10% of the technical names. She tried calling IT to ask what some of the groups did, but they were busy and told her, if nothing was broken, she probably should just approve what people had already. Another manager said he spent about 2 hours on his first access review trying to understand everything. By the third quarterly review, he realized he was approving the same things every time and nothing's changed. So now he has just clicked through it in 10 minutes. What struck me wasn't that these were careless people. They were thoughtful managers trying to do the right thing, but the process gave them no way to make informed decisions. They were being asked to review technical implementation details when what they actually understood was whether their team needed access to certain business systems. The completion rate looked great. The actual security value was essentially 0. The fundamental problem here is that reviewers lack the context necessary to distinguish appropriate access from excessive access. They receive the technical information without understanding what those technical constructs actually allow someone to do. A manager may understand they understand that their team member needs access to financial reporting systems, but when that need gets translated into 8 different permission groups with technical names, they can't map technical permissions back to the business requirement. Beyond technical context, reviewers also lack business context to make informed decisions. They may know They may not know that Jennifer changed roles 3 months ago and no longer needs the access she was granted to in her previous position. They might not know that the project requiring certain permissions ended. They may not know or realize that someone has access to both sides of a separation of duties boundary because those permissions appear as separate line items in a long list. The incentive structure makes the problem worse. Organizations measure access review success by completion rates and timelines. Did the manager finish the review by the deadline? That's what gets tracked. That's what gets reported to leadership, and that's what determines whether the organization is compliant. Nobody measures whether the manager made good decisions. Nobody tracks whether the appropriate permissions were removed. Nobody evaluates whether the review actually reduced risk. Proving everything takes minutes. Investigating each permission takes hours. The organization rewards speed and punishes, thoroughness. Is basically what it comes to. But here's what makes this particularly frustrating. The organization appears to be doing everything right from a compliance perspective. Compliance frameworks require documented access reviews. Auditors check whether those reviews happened on schedule and whether someone signed off on the results. The organization can produce reports showing 98% completion rates, certifications by business owners, and a clear audit trail. From a compliance standpoint, the control exists and functions. The documentation proves it. But documentation of process completion is not evidence of security effectiveness. Just because a review happened doesn't mean it accomplished anything meaningful. Organizations optimize for what gets measured and audited. If auditors ask, hey, can you prove access reviews occurred? And don't ask how many inappropriate permissions were identified and removed, then organizations will focus on producing evidence of reviews rather than producing better access decisions. This creates a dangerous illusion. Leadership believes they have an effective control against privilege creep because they can see completion metrics and audit evidence. Security teams know they have a problem but struggle to articulate why a process that appears properly implemented just isn't working. Improving access reviews starts with accepting that reviewers are not security experts and shouldn't need to be. The process should leverage what reviewers actually know. Who on their team needs to do what, rather than requiring them to understand technical implementation details. Frame questions in business terms. Don't ask a sales manager to review Active Directory group memberships. Ask them to confirm which team members currently need access to the customer database, the pricing system, or the contract repository. Let technical teams handle the mapping between the business requirements and the technical permissions. Provide context that helps reviewers spot problems without requiring them to investigate every line item. Show when access was granted, flag permissions that haven't been used in 90 days. Highlight individuals whose access differs significantly from the peer group. Present information that makes anomalies visible rather than buried in long lists. Consider breaking large annual reviews into smaller, more frequent checkpoints. Review access when someone changes roles. Review permissions that have gone unused for an extended period. Review access that appears unusual based on peer comparison. Those smaller, targeted reviews are way more manageable and catch problems sooner. Separate routine renewals from exception reviews. If automated analysis can identify 95% of access appears appropriate and 5% warrants investigation, don't force reviewers to look at everything with equal attention. Go ahead and focus human judgment where it adds value. Make it easier to say no than to say yes. Default to removing access unless the reviewer actually confirms it's still needed. Provide processes for temporarily suspending questionable access for investigation without creating any major incidents. Create appropriate friction for build approvals. When it comes to looking beyond periodic reviews, even with all these improvements, periodic reviews have inherent limitations. They happen too infrequently, to catch problems when they matter. Annual or semi-annual reviews mean inappropriate access can persist for months. Organizations need, complementary controls that work in real time. Automated deprovisioning when someone changes roles or leaves the organization. Just-in-time access that grants permissions temporarily for specific tasks and automatically expires them. Usage monitoring that identifies dormant positions. Role-based access models that make it easier to grant appropriate access initially. These controls reduce reliance on periodic human review by preventing inappropriate access from being granted in the first place, or removing it automatically when it's no longer needed. Access reviews remain valuable, but they work best as one component of a broader access governance program, rather than as the primary control preventing excessive permissions. So the point here, isn't that reviews are hopeless or should be abandoned. The point is that completing the process isn't the same as achieving the outcome. And organizations need to be honest about which one they're actually accomplishing. If your organization conducts access reviews, ask yourself whether you're measuring whether reviews happened or whether the reviews worked. Can your reviewers actually make informed decisions with the information you provide them? Do you know how many inappropriate permissions were identified and removed in the last review cycle? If you're designing or improving an access review process, focus on enabling better decisions rather than just documenting that decisions occurred. Think about what reviewers need to know, how much time they realistically have, and what you're asking them to do. If you're early in your career, pay attention to this pattern, right? Security controls that look effective on paper but fail in practice are very common. Understanding why requires looking beyond whether the control exists to examine whether it can actually work, given human behavior and organizational constraints and available information. Access reviews become a checkbox exercise when organizations design processes that reviewers can complete but cannot complete well. The solution isn't to make reviews more burdensome, it's to make them more effective, by aligning what we ask reviewers to do with what the reviewers can actually accomplish. The goal isn't completed paperwork, right? It's better access decisions. Until we design processes that audit artifacts instead of generating security value. So subscribe for more of this every week, and I'll see you in the next one.